Hello, this is Mark Pearson, and welcome to the Honor and Knowledge channel. This is the second video in a four-part series that is providing information in support of a theory of what occurred in the 2020 elections. I had developed several videos just prior to the 2020 elections that provided data, calculations, and the methodologies that led to my predictions for the 2020 elections. Video 1 presented basic information and began the analysis, focusing on the specific House districts that I had predicted would switch from one party to the other, but didn't. Video 2 provides some historical information as well as current events that provide a structure and a sense for why the elections went the way they did. Sort of like doing a puzzle, trying to piece together a picture, all directed at developing a theory or something that can be used to provide a rationale, an explanation based on reality. Video 3 will take the result of Video 2 and apply some data from the actual elections. Not theoretical knowledge, but actual data from the House elections, in order to determine the validity of the theory. Lastly, Video 4 will provide a similar validation of the theory, but this time using the result of the Senate elections. Then conclusions will be presented, along with lessons learned and what I consider to be silver linings. So let's do a quick recap of my pre-election predictions. First, I provided several predictors and prediction models that indicated that President Trump was going to win re-election, and probably by more than what he won in 2016. For the Senate, I predicted that the Republicans would hold the majority with at least 52 seats. For the House, I predicted that the Republicans would also gain a majority, a small one. Specifically, I predicted an overall gain of 26 seats for the Republicans. That would mean a total of 223, with 218 needed for a majority. Because the data I used was robust and pretty conservative, not conservative politically, but conservative statistically, I was very interested in determining where I had gone wrong in the predictions. I waited for the election data to become available, at least most of it, and then I commenced analyzing, comparing the actual election results versus the predictions. I focused on the House elections because there was a lot more data in the House elections. I then prepared a video twice with the results. The video is way too long and complicated, so here we are, a four-part series. In video 1, I presented the information about the predictions and some basic information about the election results. One specific item discussed was that there were 4 seats I had predicted would go from the Republicans to the Democrats, but only 2 did. I had also predicted that 29 seats would go from the Democrats to the Republicans, but only 7 did, as long as New York 22 stays with the Republicans. So that means that there were 22 seats that did not switch from Democrat to Republican as I had predicted. Taking a look at that list of 22, I determined that there were 13 that really were supposed to go over to the Republicans, while 9 were really supposed to go to the Republicans. So I did further analysis on the 13. I took a look at each of the 13 congressional districts, demographics, geography, history, candidates, and so on. One significant factor was identified. All of them are located near big cities. And then moving away from the data, moving away from the actual election results this year, I took a look at historical information, took a look at information I could find that could possibly point me in the direction of determining what I had missed, where I had gone wrong, what had happened this election, and also what did I miss in my reevaluation, my reanalysis of the actual election data. As an aside, let me point out that my House predictions were not totally off the mark. A lot of pundits were predicting that there would be a blue wave and the Republicans would lose a lot of House seats. The exact opposite happened. The Republicans did gain several House seats, just not enough for the majority. They didn't gain as many as I predicted, but they did gain enough to come close. It looks to me like it's panicked the Democrats. So what was the historical information that I found that seems to fit what happened this time? Here's a quote I need to read that will possibly impact you to the degree that it impacted me. The pool of people who appear to be available and more vulnerable to an invitation to participate in vote fraud tend to lean Democratic. Who wrote those words? Both of the authors are supporters of the Democratic Party. Glenn Simpson, the co-founder of GPS Fusion. You know, the group that took money from the Clinton Foundation and the DNC and then hired Michael Steele to create the Steele dossier. By the way, Mr. Simpson contributed his own money to help finish that dossier. The other author is Larry Sabato, a University of Virginia professor who is a talking head on a lot of news shows. I found that quote used in an article published in 2004. The article was entitled, "How to Steal an Election," and written by Mr. John Funn. The article was published in the City Journal, a product of the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. Here's the whole paragraph from that article that included that embedded quote. Pretty interesting. Wholesale vote fraud is on the rise again, almost all of it trying to elect Democratic candidates. The reason that the cheating is happening overwhelmingly among Dems these days may have something to do with who supports the respective parties, says Larry Sabato and Glenn Simpson in their book, Dirty Little Secrets. Republican voters tend to be middle class and not easily tempted to commit fraud, while, quote, the pool of people who appear to be available and more vulnerable to an invitation to participate in vote fraud tend to lean Democratic, unquote. Most incidents of wide-scale fraud, agrees Paul Harrison, director of the Center for American Politics at the University of Maryland, quote, reportedly occur in inner cities, unquote. Not voter fraud. Vote fraud can mean a lot of things that fraudulently impacts the accuracy and quality of the election results. There's more, but let me say that until I did this research, I never knew how big of a problem vote fraud was in our country. And I was very surprised as I was with the election results. It turns out that there's a lot of information out there on what I would call ancient history, meaning 100 years old, and not so ancient history associated with vote fraud. Another quote from the 2004 article. Election fraud is expanding. This past March, in just one of many recent cases, Texas Representative Ciro Rodriguez, chairman of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, lost a close Democratic primary after a missing ballot box suddenly showed up in South Texas, stuffed with votes for his opponent. Rodriguez charged fraud, but could never definitively prove it. The circumstances were eerily similar to those that tipped a 1948 Senate race to Lyndon Johnson. Election officials found ballot box 13 several days after the election. It held 203 votes, all but one for LBJ. Amazingly enough, the voters had cast their ballots in alphabetical order. Here we can see how vote fraud can impact the results of an election within the Democratic Party also. And more importantly, the mysterious appearance of ballots well after they should have been identified and counted. We also see a statement about the difficulty associated with proving vote fraud. The author of the article then continued and provided some history regarding Tammany Hall in New York City, and went on to write the following. The immigrants flooding into New York were easy prey for the Tammany polls. Each state then set its own standards for naturalizing new citizens, and New York's were lax. In 1868, The Nation reported that Tammany Hall had set up a naturalization mill, instantly certifying folks right off the boat as citizens and Tammany voters. In 1996, the Clinton administration similarly sped up the naturalization of up to 1 million new citizens so that they could vote in time for that year's election. I recently listened to a discussion by a Minnesota police officer of Somali heritage. He described how immigrants are not savvy, are not knowledgeable of our election process, and can easily be taken advantage of. There are lots of YouTube videos out there about ballot harvesting in Minneapolis-St. Paul area. I've provided a link to one in the description below. As a little aside, noted in the article was the fact that of the 19 terrorists that were involved with the September 11th terror attacks, 9 of them were registered to vote in Florida or Virginia. In the last few days, I started watching news again, and I started seeing and reading about several poll watchers that presented information about purposeful actions in the voting areas to get the Republican poll watchers removed from the area, or otherwise blocking their ability to do their duties. There's something about that in that article, How to Steal an Election. Here it is. There were instances of voter fraud, of poll watchers being chased away, of delays in reporting returns, of unopened and uncounted ballot boxes. Well, that was written about a century ago by a biographer of William Randolph Hearst, who had run for the New York City mayor office in 1904. He went up against the Tammany Hall Democratic Party machine, and he lost. Enough said. No further words needed. And now a last quote from the article, and then we'll summarize our learnings. After the article presented some information regarding some 2004 events, where city clerks identified thousands, yes, thousands, of fraudulent voter registration forms, the article goes on to say, why is such activity proliferating? It flows from the success of Democratic lawmakers in pushing aside clear, orderly, and rigorous voting procedures in favor of elastic and inclusive election rules that invite manipulation. A machine for corruption is the 1993 Motor Voter Act. the first bill that President Clinton signed. Among the many abuses it has spawned, the motor voter law seems to have enabled illegal aliens to vote for Democrats, evidence suggests. A 1996 INS investigation into alleged motor voter fraud in California's 46th congressional district discovered that 4,203 illegal voters possibly cast ballots in the disputed election between Republican Robert Dornan and Democrat Loretta Sanchez. Dornan lost by fewer than 1,000 votes. Lessons learned? Big cities are where vote fraud occurs easiest and most. To me, that implies that with our current processes for elections, the bigger the city, the bigger the vote fraud. 2, that immigrant populations are very vulnerable. 3, the increase in the flexibility of the voting process is increasing the ability to manipulate the voting process. A little side note here about that there are many articles out there that discuss voter fraud and provide a number that's tiny, 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 like 0.00000 something or other percent. The problem is, most of it doesn't get reported. It's the tip of the iceberg. So the question is how big is the iceberg underneath? Well, this time we found out that it was big enough to impact us. Sometimes it only impacts an individual candidate, but this time it impacted, I believe, a lot. And the more I looked into the subject, the more I came to realize that the media was discounting the role and magnitude of vote fraud in our elections. The mail-in process in many states, not the absentee ballot process, but the mail-in process, appears to me to be perfectly designed to create many opportunities for vote fraud. The mail-in process has many points in it that are very susceptible to vote fraud. One example of vote fraud are ballot boxes, or their more modern electronic equivalent, like USB cards, showing up late or mysteriously disappearing, normally with just barely enough votes to swing the election. I've got a link in the description to a video regarding 47 USB cards disappearing. By the way, I do need to point out for the record that I did find a single Republican vote fraud case. 2018, the 9th Congressional District in North Carolina did not have its 2018 first vote certified by the North Carolina Election Commission. There were allegations of fraud which later on were proved to be correct. That's the single Republican vote fraud case I came across. Besides the link to the video on the 47 missing USB cards, I've also included links to 2 other recent videos. One is from Tulsi Gabbard. She created a video just prior to the election documenting her position regarding the need to pass laws to restrict the process of harvesting of ballots that most states allow. I recommend watching it. The other video is from Jane Fonda. Let me just say up front, I don't recommend watching it. In that video, however, she makes a very interesting statement. She said that COVID-19, this pandemic, was, quote, God's gift to the left, unquote. COVID-19 was, of course, used by the Democratic Party to support a huge growth in the mail-in ballot process. Ballots were sent out to people who didn't even request them. Based upon the information I've come across regarding how vote fraud is conducted in our country, I can't dream up a more diabolical way of impacting our election process than mail-in ballots. So before we test the theory, gotta know what the theory is. Vote fraud. Looks to me like the Democratic Party significantly increased their ability to conduct vote fraud through mail-in processing. So what's the theory that we're going to test? That vote fraud is the basic reason why the election turned out the way that it did. The Democratic Party used COVID-19 as a reason to greatly expand mail-in ballots. Those mail-in ballots were very susceptible to vote fraud. They focused on House seats. Pelosi and other Democrats were desperate, let me repeat, desperate to maintain a Democratic majority in the House. They thought that the Republicans were going to retain a majority in the Senate, and I honestly believe that the Democratic elites thought that President Trump was going to win re-election. So they desperately wanted to maintain a majority in the House. One clue that I believe supports the Democratic elites did not think that Joe Biden was going to win the election is that it wasn't until pretty late in the game that former President Barack Obama came out actively to support Joe Biden. I believe that he did it just towards the end so that he and his wife could not be blamed for Joe Biden losing the presidential election. This information could actually be the subject of a future video, but let's move on for now. Democrats were able to protect some congressional districts this election that were important though in order to maintain a majority in the House. But each ballot also had a Senate candidate, if there was one going on in that state, as well as a presidential candidate. So let me repeat the very simple but terrible theory is vote fraud. The mail-in ballot process greatly increased the capability to conduct vote fraud. Harvesting was a big tool, as well as the normal, quote-unquote, tactics of vote fraud. For example, having some previously unidentified ballots showing up right at the end to change the results of an election. Remember the video about those missing 47 USB cards? Now, I'm not an expert in that area. I don't really know what that means, but seems like each one was at least one big ballot box, maybe more. And part of this theory is the big city factor. In other words, it includes the belief that most of the fraud that occurred or is occurring is near or in large cities. Allow me to give a made-up example to illustrate the theory. Let's say there's a House district near a large city, held by a Republican. The district leans well Republican. There's no scandal with the candidate for the Republican Party, and yet the Democratic Party candidate wins the election. Wouldn't that be enough to raise an eyebrow? Shouldn't that be enough to raise an eyebrow? Remember the old saying, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, then it's probably a duck. If no good explanation is readily available for unexpected election results, if it looks like something weird happened, then based upon the historical information and the ongoing problems with, for example, with immigrant populations being vulnerable, the greatly expanded mail-in process apparently being easy to manipulate, such as with harvesting of the ballots, along with influencing how the ballots are completed, if not even worse than that, and so on, vote fraud was probably the cause of the unexpected results. Perhaps 1 or 2 or 3 unexplained election results may not be significant, but 22 unexpected results are pretty significant. The significance of the information gleaned from those 22 actually will increase in importance in video 3 when we take a look at some other House seats and how they did not go the way they were supposed to. So what about the 2 House seats that were supposed to switch over to the Democrats, at least in accordance with my predictions, but they stayed with the Republicans? Well, neither one of them is part of a big city. They're both pretty rural. New York 24 does include the city of Syracuse, but the big majority of that district is rural, upstate New York. And we all know that the center in New York State for politics is in New York City and maybe Albany. And New York District number 24 is far away from those. The other district is California District 25. It's in Los Angeles County. You'd say, well, isn't Los Angeles a big city? Los Angeles County is a huge county. It is bigger than the combined territory of Delaware and Rhode Island, and it's a single district. And it's a pretty rural district also. And something that will also come up in video 3 is pertinent to California District number 25. It has a significant Hispanic population. And are there any other House seats besides these 2 that did not swap over to Democratic and the 22 that did not swap over to Republican? Anything else that can be used to support it from the House elections? Why, yes, there are 8 what I call November surprises. In other words, there were 8 House districts that the elections went contrary to what I predicted and what I think anybody else predicted. And oh, by the way, these 8 House seats were not on anybody's radar. They weren't on my radar. I wasn't watching them. And I don't think the Democrats were watching them either. 7 of these 8 November surprises were House districts that swapped unexpectedly from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And 1 was an unexpected switch from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. Oh, by the way, any guess on what was located near that one swap over to the Democratic Party that was a surprise? Yep, a big city, Atlanta. We'll go into detail about all these 8 in video 3. So let's summarize. We're near the end of this video. In this video, I presented information related to vote fraud in the United States and certain characteristics of that vote fraud. And the information in the data appeared to point to the fact that vote fraud was the single most important factor that I hadn't included in my predictions. So in the next video in this series, I'll be presenting information about the 8 November surprises, providing some detail about each of those 8 House districts and how they do or don't support the theory that I've been presenting in this video. In video 3, we're also going to be talking about something else that's pretty important, an apparent significant shift in the voting pattern of the Hispanic population. In video 4, we'll be taking a look at the results of the Senate elections and seeing how they integrate with the theory on why the House elections turned out the way they did. Then we'll summarize the 4-part series, try to give an elevator speech, a very short speech that can explain everything. along with my views on what the silver linings are from this election. Thank you for watching this video, and thank you for sharing your time.